I'd like to begin this brief overview of Florence's history leading into the early modern period with a discussion of the course title and the title of this week's lecture. So, Florence's Forgotten Centuries. What does that actually mean? And why were they, quote unquote, forgotten? Well, the short answer is that it comes from Eric Cochrane's book of similar title, which we will be reading later on in the course. The long answer has to do with some prejudice, or should I say preference, among historians and art historians for studying the Renaissance, singular, with a capital R, which comes just before the period, and the Risorgimento, which took place afterward. I should note that this preference is not limited to historians. The timeline that I've posted on our website comes direct from Florence's tourism board. And according to them, nothing happened between 1533 and 1737 that is of any note. So again, this historical preference for studying the Renaissance and the Risorgimento, the two periods that sort of bookend our period, is definitely not limited to academia. But the fact historians have devoted the lion's share of their attention to the Renaissance, or Rinascimento, as it is known in Italian, seems almost self-explanatory, doesn't it? Even for those of us who have little formal knowledge of the period, that is, if we want to understand the Renaissance as a period, more on that next week, the very word, coming from the French rebirth, has entered our common parlance. We hear all the time about cultural renaissances, Renaissance men or women, to mean a person who is well accomplished in many fields. And then there's the entire history of the Renaissance. That is, the history of the way historians since the late 18th century have treated the centuries between the mid-1300s and the early 1500s. With the efflorescence of vernacular Tuscan in the 14th century in the works of Dante and Boccaccio, the rise of the Tuscan schools of painting in the 15th century, the glories of the Renaissance in the works produced by Michelangelo and Botticelli, the inventions of Leonardo da Vinci, in the rise of vast international banking networks of the Peruzzi and Medici, and most importantly, for a certain stripe of political historian studying the rise of nation-states, Florence's many attempts at self-government in the highly lauded, but in reality rather problematic Florentine Republic, and in the version of democracy that was supposedly practiced there. All these make Renaissance Florence a prime target for academic study. So with Machiavelli and Guicciardini having penned their famous political works in the early decades of the 16th century, and the Roman Emperor Charles V's largely Lutheran army pillaging its way down the Italian peninsula to sack Rome in 1527 and trap Pope Clement VII, a Medici pope, no less, clutching his knickers in the Castel di Sant'Angelo, historians might be forgiven for thinking that the most interesting and historically important period of Tuscan history had come to a close. At least, that is, until the revolutions of the 19th century, the Risorgimento, or or as it is otherwise known as the political unification of Italy, which took place in the 1860s, when Florence, as well, briefly served as Italy's capital. I mean, after all, there was just the creation and unification of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany in the intervening years, when the Medici were assumed to have descended into dynastic despotism. When they ostensibly retreated to their palazzi in Florence and in the Contado, the surrounding countryside, to hoard art, traipse around with questionable characters of both sexes, gobble up delicacies, and become gaudy and inbred, and generally to behave like aristocratic Europe's rich but rather embarrassing and uneducated third cousin. Right? I mean, how could you blame them? Here we have a portrait of Gian Gastone, who is the last of his line, sadly, dies completely gouty and bedridden. And with his kind of heavy face, the eyes that are set a little bit too close together, the very large Medici nose, and all the trappings of what he considers his state around him, his hand on the crown, the Armin, and of course the Duomo of Florence in the background, historians in some cases might be forgiven for thinking that things had become a little bit decadent. Well, I would argue that in the centuries leading up to the end of their line, that it's actually the contrary. There are plenty of things to draw our historical attention. And the purpose of this class is just that, to examine those centuries, and for you all to debate if Tuscany, and perhaps Italy, Italy and the Mediterranean in general, really did become a backwater in these centuries, as some historians. And until recently, the trend among historians of European and particularly early modern European history was to suggest just that. So Lorenzo di Medici, Il Magnifico, or the Magnificent, was generally considered to be the last Medici of note. There we see him here, next to Cosimo I, Pater Patriae, or father of the country. That is, unless historians were feeling generous and decided to throw the first Grand Duke Cosimo I a bone, given that he had, after all, conquered Siena and united a considerable swath of Tuscany under Florentine and, well, more particularly, Medici rule. More on him later. It bears noting that the magnificent Lorenzo, so called for his considerable patronage of great philosophers and master artists such as Michelangelo and Botticelli, not to mention the fact that he was a fairly gifted statesman and not entirely pathetic poet, died in 1492, the same year that Columbus, a Genoese, but we'll forgive him for that, sailed the ocean blue. The Great Atlantic Shift, as it has come to be known, had started. The centuries of empire building among the centralizing, bureaucratizing states such as Spain, France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire had begun. The old world of the Mediterranean, with its now silly-looking fleets of galley ships, ships that were unable to navigate the rough waters of the Atlantic, the Mediterranean was beginning to fade into the background. One of the last nails in the proverbial coffin was the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, a massive naval battle that saw Christian forces led by the Venetians savage the Ottoman fleet, but in the process decimate their own arsenal, an early modern Pyrrhic victory. So the rulers of the sea, the old rulers of the sea, the Venetians, the Genoese, their resources exhausted, had essentially left open the back door to the Mediterranean, permitting the so-called northern invasion, a flood of essentially Dutch and English ships into the Middle Sea, who, with their heavily armed, large-hulled, seaworthy ships, overtook the carrying and commercial in luxury goods like carpets from Aleppo and spices from India. This worked out particularly well for England and the Netherlands as the continental overland trade routes were disrupted during the 16th and 17th centuries in the wake of the Protestant Revolution and decade after decade of brutal religious warfare. So by the time the dust had settled in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, Spain's Atlantic Empire was already challenged by French and English privateers, settlers, and plantation owners, those who were engaged in the triangle trade of guns, slaves, sugar, and rum. And the Dutch were turning a tidy and very bloody profit in the Indian and Southeast Asian spice trade. So, as part of the continued narrative of northern superiority, the Dutch invent the telescope. England, after several bloody revolutions, establishes a constitutional monarchy. An apple falls on Newton's head. Cue the scientific revolution. Spinoza, Voltaire, and Rousseau bring Europe the Enlightenment. A few wicked heads get rolling in France, and voila, we've arrived at the modern age. 1789 has come and gone, and we can, if we wish, look all the way back to Florence in the 15th century to thank them for getting the ball rolling, and then for having stayed in their corner to let the big nation-state empires invent modernity. So that, in a very fast and, I'll admit, blithe summation, is why Florence had a few forgotten centuries. As Cochrane and others after him rediscovered, the early modern period in Tuscany, precisely that period between the two bookends of the Renaissance and the Risorgimento, witnessed events and discoveries that would shape not only the history of Tuscany and Italy, but Europe more generally. The first Grand Duke, Cosimo I de' Medici, built a centralized state in Tuscany with a combination of military prowess and bureaucratic cleverness, no small feat given his geography, and storied history of regional diversity in both culture and traditions of governance. Looking here at Leonardo da Vinci's bird's eye view map of Tuscany, it is easy to understand how the fortified hill towns and hilly, sometimes mountainous countryside of the middle part of the Italian peninsula, which was also crisscrossed by major rivers, could present a challenge to unified, centralized government. It is also part of the explanation why medieval Italy in this region developed as it did, with a rich tradition of governance via local communes or city-states, each justly proud of their traditions and of outside powers like the Holy Roman Empire, the French, or the Papal See that for centuries threatened to deprive them of their autonomy. But aside from the political history of early modern Florence and Tuscany, Firenze and Toscana contributed to the economic, scientific, and cultural development of Italy and Europe as a whole between 1550 and the mid-18th century. Galileo, a by birth, and his famous silencing and house arrest by the Inquisition are the most well-known examples of Tuscany's contribution to the development of modern science. But this period also saw the creation of the scientific society, the Accademia del Cimento, which was patronized by Leopoldo de' Medici and run by some of Galileo's pupils. It would become the model for the Royal Society in London, where Boyle would test run his theories about the scientific method and with whom Isaac Newton would sometimes converse when he wasn't too busy sticking lenses behind his eyeballs in order to understand prisms or poisoning himself, trying to turn lead into gold, his basement alchemical experiments. But it was also a period of terrestrial as well as philosophical exploration for Florence and Tuscany, as the Grand Dukes, beginning with Cosimo I's creation of his privateering fleet, the Knights of St. Stephen, or in Italian, the Cavalieri di Santo Stefano, took to the seas to combat North African and Ottoman Turkish pirates, to capture vessels of their own, and to engage in the chillingly commonplace Mediterranean slave trade. Cosimo and later his heirs, Ferdinando and Francesco, turned the seaside village of Livorno, bought from the Genoese in the early 15th century, into a military and commercial stronghold. They created the first free port by allowing duty-free storage of goods in the port's warehouses. In the same centuries that the Inquisition was hunting down heretics and the Jews were being chased from France after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, the Grand Dukes extended blanket religious protection to attract religious minorities, especially the commercially powerful Sephardic Jewish merchants of the Iberian Peninsula, to settle in the port. The result was a polyglot, cosmopolitan city that was the crux of trade in Mediterranean and, via the international networks of its merchants, also in a more global sense, as goods such as dried herring that was fished in New Orleans, or New England, was traded by English merchants in the port for cash, or specie, which they would then use to buy carpets in Aleppo that had been made in Persia, or diamonds that had been mined in India, and bring the whole lot back to London to be re-exported to European markets for consumption. So there's evidence to at least suggest that these centuries should not indeed remain forgotten. And what about that quote from our syllabus, which, by the way, also comes from Eric Cochrane, seeing a trend here, about Florence being the most turbulent city between Ghent in the 14th century and Paris in the 19th? If it was, how on earth did Florence come to be taken as a model for self-government by generations of present-day scholars? What sort of conflicts caused all of this turbulence, and how were they settled? How does the cradle of the Renaissance, as some scholars have called Florence, develop from such a tumultuous environment? Certain answers to these questions you will undoubtedly find in your reading for this week, but I'd like to suggest some ways for thinking about the development of Florence in this lecture. First, it's important to keep in mind that Florence and Tuscany more generally have witnessed intense and continual human habitation in certain places on a very urbanized scale for millennia. Before the Romans set up Florentia on their crucially important north-south trade route, the major highway, the Aurelia, the same region was populated to some extent by the Etruscans, a complex and mysterious pre-Roman civilization about which we still know relatively little. But we do know that their religious beliefs and governing practices were incorporated with those of the early Romans. In Fiesole, a hill town that is now part of the modern city of Florence, one can still visit the very impressive ruins of a Roman amphitheater. Under the Piazza della Signoria, and indeed under many of the churches of Florence, lie the ruins of Roman habitation and temples, not to mention successive levels of Paleo-Christian sites. So, in other words, while Florence was not to become a major regional player among the Tuscan communes until the 11th century, it has deep historical roots. Following the breakup of the Roman Empire and the consolidation of the Byzantine Empire in the east, Tuscany and the Italian peninsula were subject to a number of invasions, which historians in the past have characterized as barbarian, but it is more accurate in certain cases to think of them as post-Roman subject civilizations who had previously done tribute to Rome or had lengthy frontiers with the empire, frontiers which, at any rate, were porous and permitted not only the exchange of violence but also trade. The so-called Dark Ages can alternatively be thought of as a period of redistribution and regrouping as new power centers and political entities emerged, such as the Merovingians in France and the rise of the Carolingian Empire. We haven't yet talked much about religion, but keep in mind that the Church in Rome is also growing in influence and evolving in its bureaucracy during this period, as missionaries spread across Europe and gained converts. And the Church itself conducts multiple synods and conferences that lead to the evolution and vacation of its practices. Meanwhile, in the north, after Charlemagne's empire breaks up in the 9th century, regional dukedoms and feudal kingdoms develop in France, and in the Germanic-speaking regions, the Holy Roman Empire continues to evolve, particularly. Florence, meanwhile, remained not much more than a clustered village close to the more fortified enclave of Fiesole. In the surrounding countryside, the Contado, powerful landowning families with feudal ties to the northern emperors battled it out amongst each other for the best bits of land and most strategic hilltop bastions. Out of these families was designated the Margrave, the emperor's chief vassal in Tuscany and de facto ruler of the region. One of the most famous of these was a woman, Matilda. Although Lucca was the official seat of the Margraves, Matilda took such a liking to the up-and-coming riverside town of Florence that she ended up spending most of her time there. With new walls that were built in 1078 and flourishing trades in agricultural and textile products, benefiting, of course, from the town's strategic position, north-south and east-west overland trade routes, as well as its access to the Tyrrhenian Sea via the Arno River, Florence was beginning to make quite a name for itself. And the ruling families of the Contado were beginning to take note. Following Matilda's lead, in the 12th century, many powerful landowning families moved into Florence and built imposing towers from which they could survey the wattle and daub wood habitations of most of the inhabitants of Florence and rain destruction down upon their enemies in the form of arrows and scalding oil. As the towers rose up alongside one another, each family trying to outdo the other in height and scale, and all in very close proximity, violent squabbles bound to break out, and they did so in spades. The culture of these elites was very much influenced by chivalric ideals and courtly culture imported from France, from southern France, mostly in Provence. They idealized violence in the form of knightly combat and routinely engaged in military activities in the countryside, continually attempting to bring nearby communes and other settlements under Florentine dominion. Their prizing of ancient lineage, often boasting of their family ties, lines traceable to Roman elites, meant that they were in constant competition with one another to demonstrate the glory of their own family. And marriage among these elites was a highly strategic and tricky affair. A marriage was, in fact, the source of the most enduring conflict in Florence, that of the centuries-long struggle between the Guelphs, those who supported the primacy of the papal authority, Tuscany and Florence, and of the Ghibellines, who maintained their fealty to the Holy Roman Emperor. While the conflict between these groups stemmed in part from the investiture crisis between Pope Gregory VII and the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, in which the Pope claimed authority to name bishops in the Holy Roman Empire, and then Henry contested it. He was subsequently excommunicated and had to do penance, essentially, by walking around the Margrave Matilda's castle in the snow, clad only in a penitent's garb. Was one part of the enduring conflict between the Holy Roman Empire and papal powers. It also rested partly in the fact that after decades of more or less leaving Florence fairly well alone, being completely preoccupied with local conflicts in his dominions, the emperor began appointing German rather than local Tuscans as margraves, as rulers in Tuscany, something which, as you might imagine, the Florentines did not take kindly to at all. But a fable maintains, or a essentially popular story that's been handed down in the chronicles that cover the period, maintains that all the trouble between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines started because of a bride left at the altar. Buondelmonte di Buondelmonti, son of one of Florence's most powerful elite families, was talked last minute out of his marriage vows to a very unlucky lady from the rival Amidei family. It was a marriage that was designed to smooth over some long-standing grievances. Instead, encouraged by the Donati family matron, he took a bride from the Donati family, and the jilted girl's family cried foul, and the city was once again just descended into a confusion of violence and vendetta. You'll read more about this in the Brooker chapter, but suffice to say, this episode initiated a centuries-long cycle of banishment and triumphant return, as Guelph, then Ghibellines, the blacks and the whites, were tossed out of the city by their rivals, their towers razed, and property seized, only for them to orchestrate a hard-fought return a few decades later. Now, the city wasn't entirely at the arbitrary whim of rabid overlords in the period. There was ostensibly a government of consuls, men elected from the ruling families by a parlamentum of the people. While efforts were made to contain family vendettas by the election of a ruling podestà, was essentially a sort of chief of police and governing magistrate combined, from a community outside of Florence, so that he would have no ties to the warring families within the city. In reality, the city remained in the grip of elite oligarchy. Meanwhile, as trade continued to flourish in the 12th and 13th centuries, a new group in Florence was gaining strides in social and commercial influence. These were the merchants, made rich by their trade in the famously luxurious and vibrant cloth that was produced in Florence, as well as other highly trained scholars, such as the notaries. And as one might imagine, by the mid-13th century, they were rather tired of elites on the rampage, bloodying up their city and ripping business. While we should not see a hard and fast division between the elite landowning families and the wealthy merchants and guildsmen of the major and minor guilds, as there was intermarriage and some social movement between these categories, they did tend to have different priorities. The elites, as already mentioned, favored chivalric ideals, and their choice in literature tended towards novellas written in French Provençal or vernacular Tuscan. The merchants and members of the guilds, particularly those of the notaries, tended to favor the study of Latin, naturally for particularly the notary trade, and philosophy and the ancient Roman and Greek classics, which would become ever more popular in their circles as the rediscovery and translations of these texts became increasingly more available in the 14th century. Hence, we come to the culture wars of the 13th century, if you'd like to call them that. The popolo, that is the members of the major and minor guilds, to distinguish them from the laboring poor of the popolo, took matters into their own hands, the priors or leaders of the major guilds organizing and commanding the 6 city districts, each with their own militia. Their control of the city was not absolute and often short-lived, which again is something you'll read more about in the Brooker chapter this week. But by 1293, they had succeeded in codifying their power and roping in that of the more irksome elite families in the form of the ordinances of justice. And thus, by the time we head into the 14th century and the period which some historians have defined as the seedbed of the Renaissance, as vernacular literature grew and international Florentine banking networks brought increased fame and fortune to the city, we have a city that is highly conflictual in nature, characterized by the rule of a mercantile elite, but one that has a turbulent relationship with dynastic families and which will, as we will see, also have to come to terms with the inhabitants of the lower levels of its society, the popolo minuto, the laboring poor, who worked in the most back-breaking trades and felt themselves given a raw deal in a city that saw the rich becoming ever richer while they remained poor. This, taken in tandem with the wave of religious furor that swept the country and inspired the masses after the rise of St. Francis of Assisi and the mendicant orders, would yet again bring a new dimension to the politics of Firenze, the city on the Arno. And here we see the Church of Santa Croce in Florence, which is a Franciscan church. Its architecture is quite a bit more open, and it was more hurriedly built to cater to the needs of the masses in Florence than church in previous centuries. And this church is erected outside of where the city walls then stood. And characteristic also of Franciscan churches, it is capped off with a wooden roof, which would have saved both on expenditure and time. So for next week, we'll have more death and destruction to look forward to, particularly in the form of the plague. And we'll see what we make of various historians' take on the rebirth, the Rinascimento, that followed in its wake.